This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Maxar's Dan Smoot on geospatial intelligence. Our co-hosts David and Mike Grews then discuss the latest news, including a bad week for the space sector and news from the Satellite 2025 conference.
Dan, it's good to see you again. I want to just get right into it in terms of what Maxar Intelligence does and sort of the capability behind it. I mean, first of all, we're talking about just an enormous amount of geospatial intelligence that's used by U.S. governments, particularly for national security purposes. But I kind of want to get into just like the precise nature of how all this works. And sort of you've mentioned in the past, in past speaking engagements, this sort of 30 centimeter resolution in terms of like how each pixel corresponds to like a real world area of what satellites and sensors are capturing. And my sense is this is like about the size of a piece of paper. Is that essentially what we're talking about here? Is that right?
It is. And by the way, David, it's great to connect with you as well. Again, always enjoy our conversations. But yeah, when you think about 30 centimeter capabilities and what we talk about from a geospatial perspective, it is really looking at the swath piece of paper. And one of the ways I think about it too is if we're taking an image from maybe of an airport, it's literally being able to see the numbers on a tail fin of an airplane.
Right.
But you're also covering an area that might be the size of to get that imagery of size of a large parking lot. So it's really the exquisite nature to be able to capture that detail versus just getting a large area of imagery that kind of gives you roads and buildings and so forth. We're actually getting down to that really exquisite level to give you really detailed information of maybe what the object is on the ground.
And this is played, I mean, your company has played sort of a key role, crucial role in terms of the geopolitical landscape. I mean, remember back in 2022, there was Maxar satellite images that were showing up. They were showing sort of the positioning of Russian military equipment that was sort of building up on the Ukrainian border. There was imagery of Chinese weapon sites. So like, what a difference an image can make. It just sort of like changes the math in terms of the information that operators are using.
It absolutely does. And it's not just about the imagery more. It's now about how do you actually coalesce that data to actually be able to bring out differentiations. What people are really interested in is the information on the ground, but also what's changing. So it's not just about, that one image. It's about the ability to have multiple revisits into an area now, to be able to give people and the analysts what's really changing on the ground and what are the objects that are moving around. So by having that exquisite nature that you referred to, we actually can bring more intelligence to everything, by the way, from definitely on a defense and intel perspective, but also from a civilian perspective.
Right.
I'll give you a great example of that was the detailed information we provided during the Palisades fires in LA.
Mm-hmm.
That really helped, first responders really think about movement of what was going on in a natural disaster in almost near real time. But it wasn't just about taking that image that kind of gives you that stark reality of, oh my God, look what the devastation did. It also gave people reality, like, where's it moving to? So it was being able to do that exquisite detail with movement.
I mean, I think that's seemingly sort of core part of your business, right? I mean, change is the only constant, it's sort of the old adage, but I mean, anything from just like the slightest adjustments in enemy troop movements to a maritime perspective from like shipping fluctuations, or even just in terms of vegetation, in terms of, where the Amazon is at. It's just, it's sort of, I think what I find most fascinating about this is that it starts to paint this picture of who we are as a species, as a civilization, both in terms of the security landscape that they clearly, Maxar has been at the vanguard of, but also just in a bigger scope of how we're like almost looking at ourselves, like you might like look on an ant colony from above in a way that, with this level of detail that I don't know, it seems almost somewhat paradigm shifting in terms of the nature of like understanding who we are.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree with that. And I think that you said something that's really important is we do live in a world that is ever shifting right now. You're seeing it from the geopolitical perspective. You're seeing it from, unfortunately, an adversarial perspective. And being able to see that ant farm form in different ways is critically important. And the way that we really start to think about it is that, we talked about this digital twin of the world, right? And understanding in a digital real time, but where the pressure in the marketplace is going to, and where both our U.S. government and the international governments really care about is really understanding the dynamics of that changing world, and how they can make rapid decision making around that. What used to be foundational and give people weeks and months to be able to kind of assess information, they're now caring about like within hours.
Right.
And in some places, they're caring within, maybe a 90-minute time frame to make, critical decision making. So that's where I think that you're seeing this compilation of data and where the geospatial intelligence really starts to drive that kind of decision making on the ground.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the corporate environment a little, because you've operated for such a long time in classified environments, but there's such a bigger commercial environment now than we've ever had. I mean, you're starting to see companies that are sort of acting akin to space companies in a way that we just never would associate with space companies, right? I mean, like commercial retailers, like knowing the parking patterns of the rivals during commercial holiday seasons to kind of
Yeah.
gain some sort of competitive advantage. So like, what does that look like from a business perspective, but also from like a more holistic perspective in terms of we're going from this flat world to this 3D world in terms of how we look at things.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, 3D is absolutely where everything is moving to.
Yeah.
But think about the rapid change in 3D and the ability to do it. You have to do it almost from space.
Yeah.
Because trying to get that information on a low level kind of ingest takes forever. But you can actually do it very effectively if you have the right resolution and doing things for space. Because why is this important is if you think about the consumer or you think about an individual, they're really looking about their experience they're about to have in their interaction. So think about the mapping companies that are out there. They're trying to give a differentiated experience to their consumers. Well, they have to be able to provide that information at a kind of a rapid pace now, and that's just the world of which we live in.
Yeah.
Everything from people who maybe do mapping on watches, golf courses, all those things come from the same kind of dynamic, and it is all being done in 3D. And people don't realize just how you do planning and stuff around elevation, is really important. 2D flat maps don't show that, but these are the things that we're actually seeing on a day-to-day basis that just the average user needs to understand today.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about speed, because we're not talking only about speed. We're talking about volume here, right?
Yeah.
Because you're kind of harmonizing a lot of different data points here from like radar systems and drone video and of course satellites.
Right.
All of this is sort of like coalescing in this what 20 years ago might seem like just an overwhelming information paralysis in terms of the sheer processing data. But in this algorithmically fueled world, things are very, very different. So how do you scale? How do you automate? How do you kind of make sense of these so that the decision makers, not only in the corporate space, but the national security space, can operate in real time?
Yeah, I think the compute question is a big question.
Yeah.
And how actually I bring the data down. Some of the things that we're always thinking about is how do you actually bring that information to faster processing? And a lot of people think about, oh, it's just about the imagery and getting it down. It's actually about where do you actually compute the processing of that imagery to really get that information that's required.
Yeah.
Things that we debate all the time in the marketplace, especially from a commercial perspective, is do you send sensors up that have compute capabilities, or do you use more compute capabilities on the ground and you start talking about quantum computing and large language models
Are you
that
talking about sort of like processing in orbit?
yeah,
Effectively.
there's been the thoughts of processing in the orbit. Now, my fundamental belief in working with my engineering teams is the rapid pace of the processing capabilities. If you look at where we've gone from large language models processing over the last couple of years, the stuff that you're seeing come from NVIDIA and actually in the marketplace now, it's rapidly evolving. That I believe that you just need to bring the information closer to how it is downlinked from the satellite and process it there.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing these us moving closer and closer to that processing capability. But there are companies that do it really well too. So we have to understand our space and role. So we look at companies like, AWS and Microsoft and others that actually have these large, compute capabilities. And how do you partner with them to make sure that you're actually bringing the right solutions together? Because we do bring multi sources of data now.
Yeah.
We're very prideful as an industry leader that we can actually use pure information to help us actually solve problems. And that probably didn't exist a couple of years ago. Everybody was trying to solve their little problems.
Sure.
We look at ones we're trying to solve, like maybe we're trying to monitor 200 sites at a time. Well, we got to be able to bring that information from multi-sensors now and be able to compute that and then bring that to the customer.
But to me, that's the real question, right? Because you're operating at new speeds, you're operating in just drastically different volumes of data. You're working across partnerships, you're working across borders. I mean, borders in themselves are sort of ill-defined to some extent, like once you get up at a certain altitude.
That is true.
But how do policymakers and corporate decision makers make decisions when speed is such of the essence in a way that is it's almost getting to the point where it's maybe beyond the scope of human operators in many capacities. And I get it in the sense that, a lot of this data is being synthesized and automated in a way that, is taking advantage of these AI fueled algorithms. But at some point you have to have a human in the loop here. And
Absolutely.
is there going to be a sort of a lag there in terms of just the operational tempo that's required to the point where we start outsourcing even some of those decisions?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest questions that we're all facing in the industry today. And I was actually talking to a major colleague of a peer of ours who's got large footprint as well. And we were actually talking about the policy challenges. It's one thing to be able to produce information and get them into, certain people's hands. It's actually, how do you actually provide the information and deal with that kind of that last mile we call of decision making? There has to be a human element when it comes to certain types of decision making, especially when you're talking about defense and intel. And I think that it's really trying to take the speed out in regards to having multiple people have to touch the information to glean what that change was or what that object is. But now that we can produce it a little faster, we can actually put it into the hands of the decision maker,
Right.
who can actually, do something a little bit faster. We are still challenged with technology moving a little bit faster than sometimes our processes and policies, and especially when you start talking at the government level. And I think that that's where we start doing, meeting with them to see how we can actually shift and change how commercial and or the industry can help speed up what might be really important a couple of years from now if there's an adversarial issue.
Right.
And so that this is kind of the change. This is that constant balance between being a commercial provider and supplying to the government.
Sure.
I think that this is our responsibility in the commercial environment to make sure that we can really validate what we're doing to make sure we can put it into the right decision maker. But there is always going to have to be a human decision maker in these practices.
When we talked about some of that new technology coming online, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention sort of the new developments with regard to quantum technologies, and particularly when it comes to quantum sensing. We're in this embryonic stage of all this, but for those who don't know, it's sort of this advanced sensor technology that kind of vastly improves the accuracy of how we measure and navigate and study and explore and like everything with the world around us, down to sort of using essentially changes in motion and electric and magnetic fields. But it seems like this has the potential to impact everything from air traffic control to even underground exploration of mineral resources. So I guess my question is, how does Maxar begin to consider this and look at some of these frontier technologies as you try to stay competitive in the landscape, but also something that has vast geopolitical implications as well?
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things. I think your last statement is one of the ones that we have to always take into consideration when we're building solutions is what are the geopolitical implications of all these decisions. But you have to constantly be looking at the advancements that are going on. You talk about quantum sensing, quantum compute, and all the different elements around those type of advancements. If there is a way to improve a sensor, if there's a way to improve the processing of information, if there's a way to change the dynamic of which we can monitor a site or location, we have to take it very seriously. One of the things I think is important for commercial is to be able to look at how we can ingest those type of capabilities. Now, the challenge with geospatial information and building satellites is it happens in time. It's not something that we can actually build an application, turn around and produce it and have it in space in 30 days.
Yeah.
Our capabilities often take a couple of years in the physics of how we actually do certain things. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be building that into our roadmap of how we modify and staying up on top of that. That's why I was talking about just the compute side. If you think about it, by the time we think about compute and we get it up in orbit, it's 3 years too late or
Right.
2 years too late. So that's why maybe you want to do the compute down on the ground where that advancement is going to be happening at a rapid rate. And how do you bring in? So you take that from quantum sensing, it's the same kind of thought process, which is what are the things you can do to modernize maybe in certain areas and advance your information flow versus what you're going to have to maybe build into your roadmap in the future. And that's a fine balance when you're running a technology company about how to incorporate that, because if you're just chasing that future, you may never get your solution up either. And
I think also in terms of running a technology company, I want to get into a little bit of your background there, but this is a question I think all tech leaders really have is how do you think about privacy? when you have all these different systems that have this incredible capacity, there are inevitably these questions about safeguarding people from unwanted surveillance. And, in many cases, I'm referring to commercial surveillance, but not just. And, in that sense, like, is this something that you worry about or, think about in terms of safeguards? I mean, how do you approach that?
Absolutely. It's actually a corporate value of our company. When we think about how we actually display imagery and so forth, yes, we do sell imagery to multiple nations, and we do mostly around we actually do the U.S. government and its allies and enterprise companies that are based in certain locations. We do have kind of areas we don't sell to. We have people we don't sell to.
Sure.
And the other thing we do think about is that privacy. 30 centimeters gives you a capability to see certain things, but it also doesn't give you capability to see some detail that it wouldn't be appropriate for us.
Right.
And there are also bounds in our licenses that I think that the governments, and I say governments, all have, that give you the limitation of what you should be, monitoring for, modern days, foundational mapping or certain types of missioning. And then there's things that, you're not licensed to go do, and you have to stay within those parameters. And we live to those because the credibility of our company, think about it, if we mismanage that, we're a commercial company. It could actually derail what we do. And, we're trying to build a healthy, profitable financial business to be able to solve these problems for these different entities. If you cross that boundary, you cross that trust.
Sure.
And if you cross that trust, you will lose all that goodwill that you've built up, for those types of things that we were very proud of. You
mentioned that 30 centimeters bit. I just sort of makes me, that's what's publicly available. I do wonder in the back of my head, how much more granular does this get in terms of the more classified realms of what we're talking about here? It's not a question for you to answer, obviously, but it's one that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. All right. Last question. This is more of a sort of a personal question in terms of your history here. I mean, you were a tech guy in these early stages. And I also understand that you were kind of a big fan of the shuttle program.
I was.
And, so that seems to naturally coalesce in terms of what you're doing now. And it's interesting to me in the sense that a lot of people that I talk to always, especially in aerospace, say, I missed it. 1960s were the heyday of the space era. And I mean, speak to that. It seems like we're just at the inception of where we're going.
Oh, I think so. I think it's, look, I've been very, very blessed in my career to work with some very disruptive companies. I was with a company that disrupted the internet and really changed the way that commerce is done. And I was there in that heyday of when all that was going on. I saw the virtualization of data centers and the expand, or think about the mass reduction in the size of data centers because some technology is a part of, and then of course disruption of software. So seeing all these big transformations was, something I'm really blessed with. When I was approached about Maxar and truly trying to understand it and realized that this was a data play. Yes, we build probably the most exquisite capabilities to sense the world. We do. We can, like I said, we can see the tail fin on an airplane. We can actually see the crosswalk in the road. We can see, all the different dynamics that are critical for information. But it was the large data and what you can do with that data to actually solve major missions that was really inspiring to me. And we are at the beginning of that. Not the end of that journey. We're just at the beginning of that journey. Multiple sensors, seeing that rapid change, putting information into, the warfighter's hand all the way to, a civilian working as a first responder. The mass implications of it, doing methane alerts, monitoring pipelines and oil wells. And I mean, all the different, things that we can do in real time is a very disruptive thing. So yes, I've always been fascinated by space. I mean, it's, who wasn't? I grew up in the shuttle era and, grew up watching the launches and, seeing all the different things. But now seeing how it can be applied to some of the disruptive markets I've gotten to participate in is just really fascinating to me. And the amazing thing is when we keep releasing some of our newer solutions, the adoption and the appetite is huge because of the fact we're moving from sensing the world to actually how we actually show change and how we actually show differentiation and speed to solve problems now on a human level. And I think that's where it's really just a really exciting time to be here. I really do think we're on the forefront of the journey of what space can actually offer. That
seems like a good place to leave it. Dan Smoot, thanks so much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing what you're up to.
Oh, thank you. Love to join today. Appreciate the time.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Hey, David. I'm at the satellite conference here in Washington, D.C., but you've been on the road too. Where have you been?
Hey, Mike. Yeah, no, I just got back from Houston. I was there at the sort of hopeful intuitive machines IM-2 landing in and around the South Pole of the moon, which, as you likely know, didn't exactly go to plan. The craft sort of landed, fell into a crater, was pronounced dead within 24 hours. It was expected to be about a 10-day mission, and it was carrying on board all sorts of commercial payloads, including this sort of rocket-powered drone, rovers, this drill to hunt for water ice, and even sort of equipment to like test the makings of this sort of 4G LTE lunar cell phone network. So there was sort of a lot going on that mission. They were able to test some things, but generally speaking, it was it's kind of considered a bit of a faulty mission, and so a decent amount of disappointment in Houston. You could feel it. You could feel it in the room.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what did the room feel like?
Well, there was this expectation almost of inevitability, right? In the beginning, it was like this feeling that Athena, which is the name of the lander, the previous one was Odie back in February of last year, didn't have any of the problems that Odie had experienced. Executive leadership was saying, basically all throughout the flight of that trip last year. There was just problems that the team were troubleshooting in real time, and sort of like these nail-biting moments all the way out to the moon. And with Athena, he didn't really have any of that, except for those sort of last few minutes in lunar descent, which, as was like the most perilous time. And again, questions with that laser altimeter, and again, this thing, the craft ended up on its side. You saw stock prices drop pretty precipitously with that. I mean, they do have 2 more missions, so there's as one NASA minister had formally put, lots of shots on goal when it comes to this attempted lunar landing. And earlier in the week, you had Blue Ghost from Firefly land on the moon. Now, this is admittedly in a different part of the moon. I think I've heard it sort of referred to as like, if you look at sort of those old landing sites, the equatorial part of the moon where the Apollo missions landed, that might be sort of akin to sort of the base of a mountain where the visibility is pretty good, and you have plenty of sunlight, and the landing zone's not as bad. Whereas landing in and around the lunar South Pole is almost like landing halfway up the mountain, where the visibility is pretty terrible. There's no trail. There's just it's a lot more difficult. And so I think when you're thinking about that, not only in terms of the CLIPS program, but ultimately, like, a modified version of Starship is meant to carry people there. And you just get a sense of how difficult that terrain is. It's a head scratcher, to say the least.
Well, and you brought up Starship, which was part of, not a great week for space last week. That mission didn't go as planned for SpaceX. They lost 4 of 8 Raptor engines after about 8 minutes of launch, and it was important because it was carrying a new version of the Starlink satellite. But some really incredible video from SpaceX as you saw the Earth tumbling in and out of view. Also last week, I'm the real downer guy, I guess, but
it's a tough week. It's a tough week for space.
The Lunar Trailblazer lost power, and like you said, the takeaway here is there are lots of shots on goal, that space is hard, but this is also in part why space is expensive, because it takes a long time and several tries to get these very difficult tasks right, and it's not always going to happen on the first time.
Yeah. With that SpaceX, sort of the second sort of tumble that we've seen in recent months, FAA now has sort of a mishap investigation to that. I think what's kind of interesting about this is, this is sort of not talked about it as often, but unlike past missions where you have failed missions and you have, an investigation they're carried out because these are public missions, SpaceX is a private company. And so this mishap investigation ultimately relies on SpaceX investigating itself. And there's all sorts of parameters. The FAA will say, we provide a degree of oversight in these things, but in terms of the real world implications of this, I mean, you had flights that were canceled or delayed in all across Florida and the Caribbean. Bigger questions of space debris, and I think this sort of leads into sort of the next story that we were going to talk about is the question of this really increased launch cadence that we're all
Yep.
looking at, and the questions of whether the infrastructure is there to support that.
Well, I feel like this has come up, I think we talked about it at the beginning of the year, and it's come up several times since then. It came up this week at Satellite again already. It came up a couple of weeks ago in Colorado, and it came up earlier this year again in Florida at another conference. And the question becomes, do these launch ranges have the infrastructure they need? Do they have the people they need? Do they have the processes they need? One thing we're hearing a lot about is how can ranges handle simultaneous launches? How do they how can they do 2 launches in 24 hours? How can they do 2 launches from ranges that are nearby? And the answers right now seem to be that the answer is no, and the answer is how do we get to yes? And
Right.
so, and then more importantly, how do you do that in a discussion in an era where there's discussion of a lot of federal government cuts? Like, how are you going to pay for this infrastructure, and where is it going to come from? Who's
That
going
was
to
my
get a
next
say in it?
question. Is like who pays for
Yeah,
it essentially?
right. And I think there, obviously the launch companies can pay for some of this, the fees they pay to launch. But the takeaway is, how do you do this quickly, and how do you get it done? And it doesn't seem to be that there are clear answers here, and that there's going to be any kind of quick solution. So, I think what'll be curious is if people want to see the launch cadence increase, and certainly the satellite industry, certainly the launch industry wants that to happen. What kind of pressure can they put on, uh, the Defense Department, the Space Force, to get the infrastructure that's needed to make this happen, and have Congress pay for it?
Yeah,
Or
I
pay
mean,
for part of it.
it's not going anywhere, right? I mean, this
No.
is. I mean, you look at what SpaceX is already doing. I mean, they have sort of a set cadence or upcoming cadence for every
Yep.
third day, I believe. That's only expected to go up. Then you got other companies like Rocket Lab, Relativity. I actually just had some news here with former the executive at Google, Eric Schmidt, is now taking over a
Yeah.
majority stake and kind of having a leadership position there. And that's a company that's talked about competing with SpaceX and also sort of establishing its own sort of plans for an industrial base on Mars. I mean, like a lot of big picture talk coming out of this. But I think
Yeah.
the thing that I
And
think
Blue
about,
Origin as well.
and Blue Origin, absolutely. The thing that I think about when I think about this, though, is when you think about that many rockets going up, just minutes of each other, it's going to sort of start to change the question and the conversation, I think, when we talk about pollution. And I think this is a really important one, because the argument in the past is that, yes, rockets do pollute, but they're
Yeah.
nowhere near the volume of commercial space air travel, and because just the sheer volume. And now, like with this kind of cadence coming up, and you look at, like, these are nitrogen oxides and chlorine and hydrochloric acid and black carbon and soot and like all of these things. And I remember back in 2024, there was a Consumer Reports study that's found food samples that had a chemical that's often associated with rocket fuel was found in them in excess, I think, of 196 food samples. So, like, these questions that were like little tangential questions on the side, they might start to be bigger questions as we kind of go forward and see, like, this launch cadence at this almost dizzying pace.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the flight delays that we saw, Florida and Texas, and I think when that happens occasionally, maybe there's some understanding, but I think the airline industry will not be as understanding if this happens more regularly.
Yeah. So
Um,
what's going on over there at Satellite? Give us kind of
you-
the inside scoop. What's happening inside DC? I gave you the lowdown
Sure.
on Houston.
Sure. So this is a show that generally highlights, I would say, satellite communication companies. That this is a commercially focused show, whereas some of the other big trade shows that we'll see throughout the year, Space Symposium is coming up. Maybe that focuses a little bit more on national security. A lot of the energy this year so far has been around direct to device. That idea that you can use your cell phone as a way to connect to communication satellites. We've seen SES and Intelsat making investments in a company called Link Global. We had Swiss 212 building a direct-to-device geo satellite for Asia. Viasat and the AI company Space 42 are are co-investing in a satellite prototype. So we're just seeing a lot of energy, a lot of conversation about that topic. I think there's going to be many more satellite-enabled devices. That's another area that we're hearing a lot about. And so I think you and I have both talked about, like, the applications of space are always what makes it curious. And when you get this direct-to-device, I think that makes it a lot of fun, and you get to see maybe a little more firsthand what the satellites are doing. In space doesn't feel quite as far away. It starts to feel very real when you can essentially put it in your pocket more often.
In that context, and I know we're just sort of wrapping up here, but I wonder sort of long term about how this is going to affect, whether you have Starlink, and you have Amazon's Kuiper network, and you have all these sort of like commercial constellations in tandem with some of the bigger government run ones, and how this will necessarily change the nature of how people work and where they live and where they can live and how they can stay connected. And well, I mean, some cases you don't want to be connected, like on a camping trip, but in all reality, it's sort of maybe it questions a little bit of the primacy of some of these traditional gathering spots or urban centers that we've sort of long relied on for the natures of economic growth and development. And in some ways that the pandemic just sort of accelerated that, but like the technology's caught up now in a way that's making this all very real. I mean, just the fact that we can do this podcast and you're in DC and I'm in Arizona, and we're traveling all around here doing interviews sort of around the country. It's sort of this brave new world in terms of what's possible. I think it's kind of exciting.
I want to talk about one last thing that came up. This wasn't from satellite, but the X-37B landed this week, and that's the Space Force's space plane. People are always fascinated by it. One, I think because it's in the shape of a shuttle. Two, because for a long time most of its missions have been classified. Right. This particular mission, we heard about something called aerobraking, which allowed the shuttle to move to a new trajectory without using propulsion, meaning it could take a little longer to track or to follow. We got an incredible view of the Earth.
Being secretive in a way.
Right. We got an incredible image of the Earth from the X-37B, which we hadn't seen before. And I guess, one quick thing was that it was not on orbit very long. This is the 7th time it's flown. This is the second shortest time it's been on orbit before it came back. So, the X-37B is just always fun. That's part of the mystery. And, we don't really know what it's doing, what it's being used for, but the mystery is what makes it fun. So it's another fun story.
It kind of looks like almost like this miniature space shuttle in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why people love it.
Yeah,
I think that's why people love it.
Yeah. So, and in that context, I mean, China's developing its own experimental reusable space plane, which there's been limited sort of trickle out of information with that, but this is developed by China's Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, which is affiliated with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So, as is much of China's broader space program, kind of folded into the military side of it. Also highly classified, also believed to be autonomous. So, kind of a lot happening publicly, but in some ways a lot more happening privately behind it.
Exactly. Great. Well, that's all the time we have this week. Thanks so much for watching and listening. We want to hear from you. If you have ideas about what's going to happen next in space, what's going to follow this kind of tough week, feel free to shoot us a note. We're at spaceminds@spacenews.com. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Mike Bruce.
And I'm David Ariosto. Thanks for listening and watching to Space Minds.